Good evening. My name is Bob Liff, and this is the CUNY Forum, a monthly town meeting that brings prominent New Yorkers together with faculty and students of the Edward T. Rogowsky Internship Program in Government and Public Affairs. Eliot Spitzer's campaign mantra in his successful gubernatorial campaign was, "Day one, everything changes." Well, maybe not everything, but there are lots of changes in store in Albany, and even more in Washington, where a political earthquake swept the Republicans out of control of both houses of Congress. For the first time in decades, Democrats control every statewide office in New York. Democrats actually picked up seats in the state assembly, where they already had a remarkably strong majority, but picked up just one state Senate seat, meaning they have to go back to the voters in 2008 if they want a complete stranglehold on government. That may not be a very palatable option for voters who just decided that one-party rule was not exactly working out in Washington. Unlike the ouster of congressional Democrats in 1994, when Republicans could legitimately claim a policy mandate through their contract with America, this was much more of a throw-the-bums-out election. Already you hear Democratic congressional leaders speaking about a smaller agenda than the activist wing of their party might like, though the measures they are speaking about, raising the minimum wage, reforming an incomprehensible prescription drug benefit, and tackling economic inequity through middle-class tax relief, for example, promises help to tens of millions of Americans who were left out of the Republican agenda. In Albany, the Pataki era is ending in exhaustion, and Governor-elect Spitzer promises to run an efficient, less partisan administration. He's talking about reforming Medicaid, increasing aid to city schools, though not in levels promised in the campaign for fiscal equity. Reality, as they say, is not what it's cracked up to be. Joining us to talk about the impact of the elections and anything else on their minds are three New Yorkers who take part in that debate. Daniel O'Donnell is a state assemblyman representing Morningside Heights in the Upper West Side. Yasmin Cornelius is the district manager for Harlem's Community Board 10, which we might note is represented in Washington by the next chairman of the powerful Ways and Means Committee. Ken Sherrill is professor of political science at Hunter. Danny, let me start with you. You've been serving in Albany under Governor Pataki. Are you looking forward to serving under Governor Spitzer?
Well, day one, everything changes, which means the governor shows up. We've had an absentee governor for at least 2 years and possibly 4 years. What we've had is somebody who has no interest in government and no interest in participating in government. And what you've seen from outgoing Governor Pataki has been an attempt to play to a national audience by picking and choosing those policies and programs that he thinks will sell in Iowa and New Hampshire and ignoring the rest of what happens in government. So clearly, day one, everything changes. We have a governor who's actually engaged in governing, which will be a very good thing for the citizens of New York.
Yasmin, Harlem is, I was up in Harlem on election night, and there's an incredible sense of anticipation. I mean, Rangel has been there for 35 years, but he's at the top of his game. But I mean, is there a sense of anticipation of what having the highest ranking person to come out of Harlem ever?
Well, being that he's my congressman, I am somewhat selfish, and I will say that now we have to share him. And I think what it brings, him being in power, it's not necessarily just the ways and means. It doesn't necessarily mean what it means for Harlem, but it's just the voice that he will have, and to represent not only the people in New York, but just a country, and letting it be known that there's issues that can be raised and he can articulate them, and then not only being able to bring back resources to our areas in New York and in our district, but also being able to vocalize the different issues that all Democrats share, for the country. The other thing is that I noticed that he is a visionary, and the empowerment zone was something that came out of his reign, and I look to see other ideas such as that, community development, progress, as well as other issues that are tackled, such as, of course, Medicaid, taxes, and Social Security, whatever, all those things that Ways and Means covers. But I think he'll be able to utilize that position to do broader issues for our community.
Ken, are expectations too high among Democrats? I mean, both in Washington, there was mainly a moderate group of Democrats that tipped the House, and in Albany, are expectations too high?
I don't know if they're too high or if they're in the wrong direction. While it may be moderates who won in the House in D.C., they were significantly more liberal than the Republicans they replaced. And the leadership of Congress is dramatically more liberal than the leadership that they're replacing. They're facing a serious problem other than the President of the United States, who certainly doesn't agree with them on anything, and that is that there is no money available to spend. And what they're going to have to do is find ways to do good things that don't cost money. Raising the minimum wage doesn't come out of the federal treasury. Using the power of Medicaid to buy prescription drugs or negotiate prices down doesn't come out of the federal treasury. You can do those things without spending money. Are they going to restore democracy in the sense of, say, returning the right of habeas corpus in the United States? We'll see if they have the courage to do that. But we're in Washington, I think the problem is one of restoring democracy. In Albany, the problem is one of a transition to democracy. And there are times when I think that Governor-elect Spitzer ought to be consulting with the people who went to the former Soviet Union and helped them establish democracy. Because New York does not have, and has not had in modern times, a system of responsible representative government. And again, that's something that can be done without spending money, but reallocation of power, which is what having a really democratic government in Albany would require, would face more entrenched opposition than breaking the bank would.
Was there a mandate in this election? Let me start with you. I mean, it seems to me that Spitzer virtually ran unopposed, with all due respect to Mr. Faso. I mean, he was essentially proclaimed governor 2 years ago when he announced that he was going to run. Similarly, in Washington, it was much more throw the bums out than it was any policy prescriptions. Is there a mandate?
Well, I believe there is a mandate. On the national level, I believe that it comes from a whole bunch of failed policies of the Bush administration. If you start with Iraq and move your way down to energy policy and other policies, the country clearly rejected them because the country is in strife and Iraq is in the civil war, and having our leaders maintain that that's not the case doesn't make it any less so. On the state level, you're right, Mr. Spitzer did not have meaningful opposition in November. He didn't have meaningful opposition in September. He hasn't had meaningful opposition in a long time. When you've been called the Sheriff of Wall Street on the cover of Time magazine, it's hard for someone to make a case against his record that he didn't get a chance to be governor. So now we've gotten there, and he's gotten that chance. The question is, what do the people of the state of New York want? And I think they want some of the things that Ken made reference to, a greater sense of democracy and participation. But that also requires somebody who's willing to listen. And what we've had for the last 12 years is a governor who had no interest in listening to anyone but himself or his advisors or the people of the cronies that put him there. And so the question is, does this governor-elect, and I hope and think that he does, want to engage the legislators like myself in actual conversations about policy and what we think should and what the balances, choices that we should make, both in budget issues and in other components of state government.
You mentioned in your comments that both the prescription drug benefit and the minimum wage doesn't cost the government anything. The government's broke, both in Washington and in Albany, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, I mean, the government is deeply in debt. I think it will take a very long time to find out exactly how much in debt the state of New York is because of the bond financing, the expenditure by public corporations, and the debts that are buried in state authorities, probably without the capability of paying them off. That does not mean that you cannot establish a legislative process in which committees function, in which all power is not in the hands of the leadership, in which public monies are spent in an unchecked fashion with no accountability. It does not mean that you can't establish a system of competitive elections in which the public has an opportunity to hold elected officials accountable for what the government does or doesn't do. Without spending money, you can do things that dramatically improve the quality of democracy in the state of New York.
Well, one of the things you can't do there's a lot of issues you can't do, that you can't affect without spending money. Housing is one. I mean, in particular, you wrestle with gentrification in Harlem, which is clearly linked to an affordable to an affordable housing crisis. I grew up at a city housing project in Brooklyn, in Linden Houses in East New York. And I remember when I was a reporter going back and looking back, it was the 30th anniversary of the project. And that year, 15,000 housing project units had opened up in the city. That's not even a dream anymore. Right. I mean, do you anticipate, do you have hopes or expectations that those kinds of issues that do cost money are gonna come to bear? Are gonna bear some fruit?
Absolutely. I mean, the whole concept now is trying to balance out the housing situation with the need for affordable housing. Really has anything to do with gentrification these days. It's really just a matter of people just trying to secure their own housing. And it's my hopes that probably in about 2 or 3 years, there's a need to look for other fundings to, I guess, doing research for other fundings. We've had a problem in the past with HUD, as Assemblyman O'Donnell has stated. There's just been a lack of communication, rather no communication, when trying to get fundings from a federal level, whether it is to support the New York City Housing Authority projects that are already in developments that are already in place, or by looking for more funding that helps with grants to allow affordable housing to take place. I wanted to just say, alongside of that, is I think there are other ways besides money that can also help with quality of life issues. Just this morning, I'm sure you are all aware of the shooting of Sean Bell that took place this weekend. And just this morning, I was listening to Congressman Meeks, who stated that he was going to do outreach and trying to find out more investigation, progress for investigation. He wanted to do outreach to John Conyers, who's going to be chair of the Judiciary Committee, to help with the investigation process, to make sure that every stone has been was it covered?
Every stone is turned over. No stone left
No
unturned.
stone has been left behind in regard to this investigation process. And this is just an example of the type of resources that we have available now, where we didn't have before. Being able to utilize the various powers that be to assist us in our own quality of life issues, whereas we may not have had that opportunity before.
You know, that kind of quality of life issue obviously is in part a civil liberties issue. We've talked about this in the past. You know, the Republican dependence on the social agenda, you know, gay marriage bashing, the kinds of old standbys that they would pull out in order to try to move voters didn't work this year.
Actually, it's never worked. Any serious statistical analysis demonstrates that Bush got no advantage from it 2 years ago, and this year, in all of the states that had marriage referenda on the ballot, Republican Senate candidates got no benefit whatsoever.
You don't believe in the past that they would have drawn out more people who might have sat home? I mean, clearly they are put on the ballot for the purpose of drawing people out.
The race for president of the United States brought people out, both supporting and opposing Bush. Once you hold partisanship constant, there is virtually no net effect. If you looked in 2004 at the states and the counties where marriage initiatives were on the ballot, and you look at the change in the percent of the vote Bush got in 2004 as opposed to 2000, Bush had less increase in the places that had him on the ballot than in the places that didn't have him on the ballot. If you look this year at the Senate races, there are only 3 Senate races in the 7 states that had, in the 6 states that had ballot initiatives. It didn't help the Republicans one iota. It may serve other purposes. It may help with fundraising. It may divert Democratic energy. But when it comes down to the vote, it was totally overwhelmed 2 years ago by terrorism, this year by Iraq, by Katrina, by all sorts of other things.
And by corruption.
And by corruption, right. I mean, but it as an issue, the statistical impact is that of a red herring.
It seems to me that the concept of what we used to call Reagan Democrats were in part chipping away at people who should economically be Democrats, but for a range of social issues, they were able to kind of bring them over into a Republican column. And always be careful about arguing with a professor on statistical data, but my instinct tells me that that social issues are a large part of the Republican strategy, of the Karl Rove strategy, whether it's appealing to their perception of a kind of a conservative evangelical base throughout the South and the West, that's part of what the Republicans have tried to do.
Yeah, I wouldn't rely on the evangelicals to be pinnacles of purity or good behavior.
I'm talking about a political analysis,
okay.
right?
But
right.
I think that the part that you're missing is that yes, there were Reagan Democrats who were in a different era, and what I would say, because the statistics, as the professor pointed out, are there. When you look at the Virginia case, where the Democratic senator won, having this ban on gay marriage on the ballot actually hurt the Republican candidate, did not help the Republican candidate to get reelected. But what we've had since 2001 is essentially our nation is suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, and we are afraid, and we used to not be afraid. And the Republicans have utilized that fear as a mechanism to say, you will only feel safe again if you do this or you do that. What we've lived through is 6 years of that not working, because all the things that we've done and the Republican majorities that they got does not contribute to a sense of us being less fearful. Obviously, for the last 3 years, gay men and lesbians have been allowed to get married in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. In that time, not a single heterosexual has been harmed by those people getting married, which means that gay marriage is better for heterosexuals than Dick Cheney on a hunting trip, okay? And so, but it's easier to couch this as a mechanism to try to inflame someone. And I think that this election has been a repudiation of that kind of strategy. The statistics don't bear it out. And I think the American people are wising up, because we are not safer, we don't feel safer, and our lives are not better. And we figured it out.
I just want to follow one thing on what Dan's saying. He's absolutely right about fear as an issue. And what broke Bush's back and the Republicans' back, if you look at the data, they're really kind of stark, was Katrina. It was the demonstration that this was a government that could not protect the American people. Did not protect the most vulnerable of American people, and had a racial component and a class component, but more than anything else, at a time of absolute national crisis involving the health and safety of the American people, the government couldn't deliver. And from that point on, it was like a house of cards in which the credibility of the Bush regime began to tumble. Questioning Iraq, or thinking that the failures in Iraq were more important than protecting us from terrorism, because that was where Bush's strength was. That turned around post-Katrina. The corruption scandals and so on. The whole thing fell like a house of cards. People may still be afraid, but they learned that the current government in Washington was not capable of protecting the average American.
Having said all this, the president made one very good point in his press conference immediately after the election, which was that while the cumulative effect was a sweep for the Democrats, so many individual races were extremely close. I mean, you could make the same argument when the Republicans took over. They won all those close races, and this year the Democrats won all those close races. I mean, you change, 12,000 votes in Virginia and Montana, and you still have a Republican Senate.
Mm-hmm.
He lost the popular vote in 2000
right,
and claimed a mandate. In 2004, he was reelected by the smallest margin that any incumbent president of the United States was reelected by in the past 100 years, and he announced that he had political capital. The margins are always tight. The margins are always cumulative. What goes around comes around.
Oh, I'm not. I'm just talking about
we have to pretty much hold on to these seats.
Yeah.
I think the other part is
which is why 2008, setting aside the president, is so critical.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this was ours to win. Rather, this is theirs to lose. I mean, this was pretty easy. And if we didn't win these seats, we would have just been idiots as Democrats, number one.
Well, we've snatched, pardon me, as a Democrat, we've snatched defeat from the jaws of victory before.
But the thing is now utilizing a real strategy to maintain these seats and widen the margin from this year's election to next year's election. And I like to see, and I'd be very interested in working and to see how we can do that. And it starts off, I think, also with local races, like you said earlier, with the Assembly and the state Senate seats. You really have to start off on a local grassroots level to build, because then that feeds into your larger population races.
We've talked about Rangel, but we also have Schumer, who is incredibly empowered right now. Nydia Velázquez is going to be the chairwoman of the Small Business Committee. Nadler is going to have a judiciary, major judiciary subcommittee on the Constitution. Hillary Clinton is poised to run for president. New York Democrats in particular came out of this looking very, very good.
We're happy about that.
Absolutely.
Right.
And I want to follow up on the point that Yasmin made, which is that, the importance of the governor's mansions and the importance of who controls them and the state legislatures is not just the policies that come out of them, it's the people who come out of them. You have to be in a circumstance where somebody who has experience, has run for office, has fundraised, has done all that, so that when there is a vacancy in a swing district, that there are viable Democrats in place who can do that. And we have sometimes forgotten that. And if you look at some of these seats that we took back, I mean, you look at John Hall's victory in New York State, or Kirsten Gillibrand, who did a wonderful job taking out Congressman Sweeney. I mean, these were people who were really poised and, right there, ready to take up the mantle. And what I think we need to recommit ourselves to is making sure that we're ready, because you don't know when someone retires or decides not to stand. You don't, all of a sudden there's a vacancy in a Senate seat and we have a fighting chance. Do we have a candidate who we can put up there and do that? And so in that sense, the 50-state strategy, which Governor Dean came up with, is so important, because we need to have people who are ready to stand up and assume higher positions of leadership. And hopefully, because of the win in these governor's mansions, we'll have a much more effective role in redistricting. Please remember, the Republicans didn't win previous elections, they stole them. Okay? They stole the Texas election by redistricting the congressional seats, and they did that because they controlled the state house. When you control the state house, you control the state lines. When you control the congressional lines, you control Congress. And so we need to make sure that we don't forget that fact when we figure out how to maintain our power.
Let me ask you, following up on that, I've always been, I've always believed that people are suspicious of one-party rule, and I think what happened in Washington was, with Republicans controlling everything from the courts to the White House to Fox TV, is, that I mean, it really is a case of power power corrupting. And right now, we've always had a comptroller, for instance, not always, but traditionally, in my lifetime, going back to Arthur Levitt and Nelson Rockefeller, we've had a governor and a comptroller of different parties. We don't have that in New York, except for Joe Bruno in the state Senate, serving the role that Shelley Silver did for the last couple of years of sticking his finger in the dike to stop the worst things from happening. Does one-party rule, do you think people are resistant to that?
No. I think people are resistant to the idea of abuse of power. But I think that having the legislature, both houses of the legislature, and the governor in the same hands, enables the voters to know who's in charge, and it enables the voters to throw the rascals out, which is what they did this year.
It also takes away excuses from the governing party. Right.
I mean, one has to ask why no serious effort was made by the Democrats to take the state Senate this year. How the Democrats could pick up 2 seats in the House of Representatives, and the population of a House seat is more than double the size of a state Senate seat, and only pick up 1 seat in the state Senate. And the question is, who is recruiting the candidates? Who is raising and putting money into it? I mean, the problem in New York is that the way in which power is exercised is by vetoing and stopping things from happening rather than by doing them. That's right. The Shelley Silver role was to stop things. And now it'll be the Joe Bruno role to stop things. And when somebody has a power to do nothing but stop things, ultimately, it's the citizens who are hurt by not having services delivered. Ultimately, it's not having funding for the schools. It's not having funding for the hospitals. It's not putting money into affordable housing, and being able to point each way and say, not me. You know, you've got to end this culture of 3 men in a room in which everyone has a veto, and instead have a system of government in which there is public accountability for public policy. The voters have to know who's in charge.
I happen to think that Shelley Silver did a very good job of stopping some very bad things from happening. You know, and I must tell you, I'm always suspicious of. I happen to be suspicious of one-party rule, and not so much in Washington, I must admit, because I think that the parties are kind of fairly large tents, or at least the Democratic Party is a fairly large tent. So. Of course, we don't know what the situation is going to be with the comptroller, with Alan Hevesy either, whether he will survive or he will not survive. But clearly, he will be replaced by a Democrat. Going back to what do you expect out of the Nadlers, the Schumers, the Velasquezes, you know, the Rangels? Obviously, what does that mean to you?
Well, some of it involves money and the realignment of the priorities of our systems. Jerry Nadler has been unifocused on a rail tunnel between New York and New Jersey as long as I've been alive, I think, and has never really had the power to do that. That would be a very important thing for our transportation and for the safety of our city. In this Republican agenda, we've never had a chance to have someone like him articulate what that is. And so that's an example of what I expect. Do I expect him to come with a check tomorrow? No, but do I expect him to be a powerful voice, being able to articulate what it is that we need and why? Not why is it better for me or for the city, but why it's better for the nation. Why is the nation safer if we have that rail tunnel? And he can make that case. And invite him on. Give him about 90 minutes, because that's how long you'll take.
I've taken those calls at 11 o'clock at night.
You have to, give him his full time. He will explain to you in full detail why it's safer for America. And with that voice and a powerful position on the Transportation Committee, he can make the case so that people outside of New York understand why it's in the country's interest, not just our own.
Same question. What does it mean? I mean, other than that makes us all feel good about all these people with committee chairs.
Well, it's a test of their ability, obviously. It's also, you can't expect too much because George Bush has veto power, and there aren't enough votes to override vetoes. But you can get into bills that are passed Congress, the tunnel, housing funding, mass transit, environmental protections, and let the president take the burden of saying no.
Right.
But getting them onto the agenda. People in New York have not been agenda setting at all nationally. We have not been establishing the terms of debate. And if there's one thing you're confident of with Charlie Rangel and Jerry Nadler and Nydia Velasquez, is they're going to establish the terms of debate. They're not quiet people.
They are New Yorkers. When you look at your neighborhood, and you have a broader view of of a lot of these issues, go ahead 2 years, 4 years. Besides the housing issues, what are the kinds of issues? What are the kinds of issues do you think are going to change for people who live in your area?
Well, I would say education is going to change. One of the
that's more because of Albany to some degree than it is even Washington, I would think.
Well, it's both. I mean, the good thing about having a congressman such as Charlie Rangel, he thinks locally. And I had the pleasure of going to the press conference when he was right after Election Day, when he talked about what it meant actually being chair of Ways and Means. And in previous discussions with him, I know that one of his main concerns and main issues are really vocational training. Every student may not want to be a journalist or a lawyer or a doctor, but just being able to utilize skills that can be taught and can be learned so they can make a better way for their own life. And I think that he's very concerned about that. He's also looking into trying to utilize certain universities to probably have maybe the uptown campuses to have exposure of of people so they can see other ways of life. The reason why I'm bringing education in, because in order to have a real development of a community, it not only incorporates housing, it incorporates jobs, and it incorporates education. Presently in our district, the 50% of the population don't have a high school diploma. And so we are trying to move that up so we can move that percentage up, and hopefully the median income will no longer be $25,000. But it's not necessarily raising it for new people to come into a community with higher education or an increased income, but it's to increase the people that live there. And so part of that is hopefully trying to change a mindset, if you can understand what.
I'm going to take questions. Tell us your name and your campus, please.
Hi, I'm Jason Shaw from Brooklyn College. Elliot Spitzer is already talking about making changes to the healthcare system of this state, mainly cutting its budget in many different ways. The last few years in Albany have been characterized by a budget process that is completed well after deadline. Do you see Spitzer making more of an attempt to have the budget done on time than Pataki ever did?
Well, I'm happy to report that we've had on-time budgets for the last 2 years. And I can assure you that that will be the top priority for Governor-elect Spitzer. One of the things that people in New York often don't understand, here in the city, no one ever asked me about on-time budgets. But outside the city, those budgets control school budgets for local public schools in school districts in the suburbs and other places. And so they need to know what those numbers are going to be. But for us, we've learned that the perception of them not being on time carries something else with them. The date for the budget, which is April 1st, goes back to a time when taxes were paid on March 15th. And so we changed when taxes get paid to April 15th, and we didn't ever change the budget date to go after. So we're always in the position of having to guess how much money is coming in while we make the budget in order to comply with the budget. And so one of the things that I hope that he does is comes up with a constitutional amendment to change that so that we actually can take the money that we get in on April 15th, figure out how much it is, and then figure out how to spend it, rather than spending our time in February and March trying to guess how much money is coming in April 15th.
That's interesting. Yes.
Hi, my name is Joy King, and I'm from York College. My comment and question is, I've been hearing some talk that Rangel is thinking about opening a draft. Do you think that's wise for opening a draft as opposed to having the troops come home? Like, we shouldn't send people who don't want to go to a war that they shouldn't have to go. We should be thinking about bringing them home.
You know,
You can all respond to that. I'm afraid to respond. Everybody's looking like, oh, you.
I happen to think that Rangel knows very well that there's not going to be a draft. I think that Rangel deeply believes in public schools, public military. I think he believes in the idea of national service. But I also think he's making a point that lawmakers who send young people to war don't have the most important thing in their lives invested in that war, which is their children. And in particular, I think you see an administration in which Dick Cheney had more important things to do than serve in the military in the 1960s, and yet is supporting sending a lot of people into harm's way. So I think Rangel believes in a draft, but I also think he knows it's not politically realistic, and he's making a very clear point in what he's pushing for.
But I do not support a draft. Let me just say that personally. I do not support a draft. I think it's a very smart political move to expose that truth that you just talked about. But if you listen very carefully to the congressman, when he speaks about it, he speaks about national service. Right. And so the definition of what that means could be much broader than what we thought it meant 30 years.
He has specifically said it's broader than just military service.
Military service. But I personally would not support that.
Yeah.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Faiz Uzaman, and I'm from Queens College. And I just wanted to say that many of the seats that the Democrats picked up in Congress have been from conservative states, and their ideologies are very conservative. So do you really think that the conservative wing of the Democratic side and the liberal side can work together to deliver the social changes that they've been arguing for, or will it just be like stagnant government?
Well, I'm from the liberal side of the Democratic Party, okay? Just so you know. But what I think that what you're saying is often being spun by the Republican-controlled media, of which there is a lot of that out there. The truth is that in many different constituencies, whoever the incumbents are got reelected. They just regularly got reelected. They brought money home. They were well liked. They saw them in a grocery store and whatever else it is. And so I think that have happened this year is we got people to focus on the issues of where the country is going. And so I don't perceive this to be a different Democratic Party. Kristen Gillibrand is not a right-wing Democrat. She was running against John Sweeney, who was a fairly conservative Republican. A variety of things happened, and she was able to articulate why the country was going in the wrong direction. I don't think that without taking back the White House, we have the capacity to wholesale change public policy. But I think that many of the people who were elected are some are conservative Democrats, some are moderate Democrats, and the truth and the challenge for Democrats is to make sure that we can establish to the nation that we have the capacity to work with one another.
And also I think furthermore, this allows this dialogue to take place not only amongst conservative and moderate and liberal Democrats, but even amongst some Republicans. I mean, in the past, people have just been held hostage on issues and have just been forced to just go with the flow, if you will, and
forcing a party line vote.
Right, and not that much room for discussion and dialogue. I mean, just even to express views to disagree. And I believe that now with these changes, whether because there are a few, I think, different types of Democrats, but with that, there's also an understanding now that we can sit down and talk about it and agree to disagree.
I think, first of all, it's a mistake to characterize particularly the Midwest and the mountain states as conservative states. And that's where the Democrats picked up a lot of seats. The Democrats, by the way, won in a landslide in New Hampshire. These were all competitive states which were divided rather narrowly, in which in previous elections the Republicans had won by a small margin. In a state like Kansas, it turns out there was nothing wrong with Kansas. That Kansas, you now have a Democratic governor.
Kansas had one of the looniest right-wing Republican party people imaginable. It was probably the most extreme bunch of actors, I think, in the country.
Right. Colorado now has a Democratic governor, both houses of the state legislature, a majority of the Colorado congressional district delegation. What happened was that a rather extremist wing of the Republican Party antagonized a large number of centrist voters in states that fundamentally were centrist. They weren't conservative states.
Except, let me take issue with you and with Danny, and I think with Yasmin as well. Why not? Let me argue with everybody.
Live it up.
I think that it was clearly part of the Democratic strategy, especially in the United States Senate, with Schumer calling a lot of the shots as to who they were going to be supporting, that they in fact went for Democratic candidates like a Bob Casey in Pennsylvania, who was pro-life, who kind of is at variance with what you might perceive as the kind of stereotypical Democratic left-leaning agenda. And and I think that was designed to kind of the Republican right has thrived starting in '94 and moving on in part by demonizing Democrats, and that Schumer was intent on not allowing that demonization to take place, and took people on a lot of major issues he did not agree with, and that most of the Democratic Party. I mean, same thing with Senator-elect Tester out of Montana.
Yes, just compare them to the people they beat, and tell me who's.
I understand compared to the people they beat, but there are times in the past when, for instance, Chuck Schumer, there is no stronger advocate of gun control in the United States, period, than Charles Schumer. But yet he went out and recruited people in the West who were strong, what are called Second Amendment supporters, people who were, strongly against gun control. So I mean,
Bob, I think the difference is that we can't impose New York City, Upper West Side values.
He's from Brooklyn.
Where I'm from, on other constituencies. Obviously, you know, I have a very close friend who used to be the chief of staff to the Speaker of the House in Indiana, and we had a bet the day before Election Day whether we took back more House seats in Indiana or more House seats in New York. And the people who are running, the Democrats who are running in Indiana were not Upper West Side Democrats, but they were people who matched the communities they came from, who were able to articulate a vision that the country's going in the wrong direction, and they matched the community that they represent. And people come to me all the time. I'm the first openly gay man to be elected to the New York State Assembly. People come to me all the time and tell me a variety of things about how they want to do X, Y, or Z, and I say to them, you have to reflect the community you represent. You can't come from outside of it. Your job as an elected official isn't to lecture to your constituents about what the right thing is. It may be to help educate them, but in the end, you have to come out of what that community is from, wherever you represent. And so what I think they chose to do was to find people who were electable, who reflected that community. Rick Santorum was a right-wing, homophobic lunatic. And the guy was nuts.
You mean that in the best possible sense?
It was all love from my heart, I feel. Okay? And so the question really was, what is the best way to take out this kind of guy? And it was with, you know, a very popular, you know, person who was out there and people knew who he was, Mr. Casey. And he won with almost 60% of the vote. I mean, election day, they claimed that was going to be one of those 51-49 things. And so I think the question really is, how does the Democratic Party thrive and continue to get people to come up through the grassroots system, but then, depending on the way the districts are drawn, find someone who matches those districts, who can articulate the Democratic Party's vision for a better America, and not be so concerned about whether or not they match everyone else's own litmus
I'm going to come to you in just a second. Both in, you know, kind of extending this out, it seems to me that this was a very unusual election. All, you know, Tip O'Neill always said all politics is local. This was very much a national election in which I think the consciousness of whether you were going to vote for Democratic rule in the Congress or Republican rule in the Congress. I mean, the best example being Lincoln Chafee up in Rhode Island, who had a 63% approval rating, and yet was voted out simply because he was a Republican, and they wanted a Democrat to vote. They wanted a Democratic vote for organizing the United States Senate. I think a party was more so, perhaps, than any time in my lifetime, was a driving force.
Well, because this gets back to the point of knowing who's in charge so you can hold them accountable. But also Rhode Island is unusual. Rhode Island is a solidly Democratic state in which Chafee was an unusual, you know, was unusual in that he was a Republican who held statewide office. I mean, the reason Democrats won in Indiana and in Missouri and in Kansas and in Colorado was that they were talking about things like a fair day's wage for a fair day's work, which suddenly became a radical position in American politics. People were talking about.
So you don't think that people were party motivated as opposed to individual oriented?
The data indicate that they were Bush motivated. That when asked, was your vote for Congress today more on national or local issues, they said national. When they said, was your vote for Congress today in support of President Bush or in opposition to President, they said in opposition to President Bush. It's quite true. President Bush dragged the Republican Party down to defeat this year in the eyes of the voters.
I think it even went further to like the state Senate seat, the Andrew Stewart Cousins race and the Spano race.
In Westchester County, which was the lone Democratic pickup.
And what was it like? Last time she lost by like 18 votes, and this time she won by
about 1,200 or something like that. Yeah.
And a lot of people just basically voted. I think the Democratic Republican fight that really supported her a great deal. People just voting Democrat on her behalf. That really helped her out a lot.
Getting back to your Bob Casey example. Okay, I mean, Bob Casey.
No, please, go on.
I mean, Bob Casey, is no supporter of abortion. He certainly isn't a supporter of same-sex marriage. If the Employment Non-Discrimination Act comes to a vote in the Senate, he's probably going to vote to make it illegal
to discriminate in employment on the basis of sexual orientation. He may not support marriage, but he'll support
Fair employment.
Right. I mean, Rick Santorum was saying, "What's next, man on dog?"
Right.
Yes, ma'am.
Alicia Da Silva from John Jay College. Since New York is one of our largest cities, why do you think they have such a lack of agenda setting power, and how do you think the lack of agenda setting power affects democracy on a local and national level?
That's because everybody's all, well, everyone has different agendas. I think that's the problem. I believe we could, I'm sure you'll hear something from all of us, but I think the problem has been we just have so many different agendas that we cannot come together and do a comprehensive agenda. I mean, we have the State Democratic Committee, we have the New York, we have the National Democratic Committee, and we have a lot of these people still on the same committees, but it just doesn't seem to be anything comprehensive to be able to address the needs for Democrats. I wanted to just say, in talking about that, I noticed that a couple of seats have not been won, like Harold Ford. We know Harold Ford didn't win. And then Bob Menendez, that was a pretty close race. And regardless of...
in Jersey.
In Jersey. A friend of mine worked on that race. He said that in looking at racial lines, in the Black and Latino communities, he was like, you know, he was the majority in Black and Latino. But still, the Menendez name just did not sink in, more or less, in the white communities. So they were pretty much, as crazy as Bob King Jr. is, I'm sorry, Tom King Jr. is, for them to, for people to still question, this had nothing to do, I don't think, between partisan lines. I think that there needs to be more of an agenda of what the type of candidate we're looking for and how we need to all stick to the candidate. This is case in point with Carl McCall when he ran for governor. This is case in point, again, with Harold Ford. We need to all come on the agenda and all support these candidates. And I'm not even I don't think it has anything to do necessarily with race, but I just think we need to all be clear and be unified. You find that a lot of communities are always unified and always stick to the Democratic line. But you know, when another candidate comes in, it could be questioned the type of credentials, or people may not feel comfortable with them representing them. Then it's an automatic switch, and in some cases, party lines are affected.
You know, it's 20 years, I think, since there's been any serious discussion of a national urban agenda, and we are uniquely situated, as you've mentioned, because of chairing congressional committees, to starting a national dialogue on an urban agenda. At some point, we've got to look at the presidential nomination process, too. I mean, after all, more people live in Brooklyn than live in Iowa. And if you wanted to have Brooklyn caucuses, it would be much easier for the candidates to go door to door and sit down in every living room than it is to traipse all around Iowa. We need to inject urban America into the presidential selection process. We certainly are well situated at the state level right now. I mean, New York City is incredibly well.
If in fact, I'm going to go to another question, but if in fact you know, Brooklyn may have more people than Iowa, but Brooklyn probably doesn't have as many registered voters as Iowa because of the incredible number of immigrants in this city and in the state. We haven't had a chance to really talk about immigration, but I think immigrant bashing, frankly, is still
another one.
You know, is still a driving force here. And one of the oddities is that the Democrats in Congress are probably closer to the president on some of the immigration issues than the kind of more right-wing, xenophobic Republicans were. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, hi, I'm Sabrina from Queens College. My question is, how do you reconcile with people who don't believe there's much difference between the Democrats and Republicans beyond deep structure? And what kind of changes can we expect in the 2 years till Bush is in president?
Well, the second part of the question is, I think that with the Democratic Senate and Democratic House, we get to articulate a different vision. We get to put bills forward. We get to say, this is the way we would do things differently. And he has the power to veto, certainly. But we get to sort of dictate some of the discussion in a way that we have not been able to do for the last 6 years. You know, it is frustrating to me as a Democrat to have young people particularly come up to me and tell me there is no difference between the parties. And there is a difference between the parties. I'm a lifelong Democrat. I will always be a Democrat. We find more ways to divide each other up, and than any group in the world, whether it's third-party candidacies or we always find some way to divide us. And I think that this election gave us a taste of what the possibility is if we don't divide it up. And if we say we're going to stand strong and we are going to do this in a unified mechanism. I believe the Democratic Party is the party of people who work for a living. I believe the Democratic Party is the party of people who cross the spectrum of race and economic strata and sexual orientation and religion. Whatever you are welcome into this party. And we need to make sure that because of that, this party is the ruling party in our country because it reflects what our country is.
Anybody else want to jump in on that? That's kind of a nice statement. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Sophia Musa from Brooklyn College. And I think a lot of voters were concerned with health care during the last election. And do you feel that the Democrats gaining control of the Senate and House will mean a shift towards implementing new health care policies?
Ken.
I think you'll see very different legislation, but I don't know if the president will sign it.
Well, except that President Clinton had a Democratic Congress and couldn't get it through in 1993.
That's right. But since 1993, people
it became kind of a third rail of politics.
But prescription medical prices have gone through the roof. The percent of people without medical insurance has gone up dramatically. Medical expenses as a percent of whatever you want to measure have gone up. And, I don't want to say it was premature to do it when Clinton addressed it, but, it's now more than a dozen years later, and there may well be a consensus. Most notably, you just saw the leaders of the big three automakers going to Bush and saying, health care insurance is breaking our backs. We need federal help on that. The interesting thing is that the push for some sort of national medical program, national health, may well come from business who no longer can afford to pay the benefits.
Well, that's certainly true. I mean, in New York, I'm the author of the Fair Share Act, which will require employers of more than 10,000 people to provide medical insurance or pay into a fund. It's modeled after legislation that was passed in Maryland.
Is that pay to play?
No, it's different than that. But it's a requirement that we've not yet passed. But clearly, what has happened since the 1993 debate is that people understand that somebody who's working full time or part time and is working for a big employer, that if they don't get the medical insurance from their employment, then they become a responsibility of the government. And the truth of the matter is that people shouldn't be able to do that. In fact, it is the competitors of some of the companies that don't provide this insurance that are the leading people forcing it, because they're saying it's competitively unfair. I give insurance to my employees, my competitor doesn't. Those people go and use the public system to take care of their health insurance. How come? And then I can't compete with them on the base bottom line. And so I think that the healthcare discussion is always at the top. It's currently the number one thing when you poll New Yorkers about what they're concerned about. And I think that concern will translate into both an attempt to find innovative solutions to the problems and also trying to make sure that the companies that people work for participate more fully in the process.
It's also, Harry Truman was talking about national health insurance in 1948. And, it's Bill Clinton, in addition to trying the health plan, which I thought was kind of a Rube Goldberg contraption, which is what they came up with. It was very hard to understand. He also was the one who said that the era of big government is over. And I was raised at a time of very expansive government. The time of the Great Society. I mean, the child of the New Deal, an activist government that can change. Hopefully change people's lives. It's kind of a core democratic philosophy. The era of big government is over. Can you really expect those kinds of broad strokes out of the government at all?
With consensus, yes. I mean, of course, things can happen.
I mean, do you see it in healthcare? Healthcare is the best example of the most, we are obviously out of line with the rest of the industrialized world to our detriment.
Can it happen? Sure. The questions are when and how. It'll probably be in an incremental fashion. You know, I think Danny is absolutely right. It comes up on the top of polls about what people are concerned about in their everyday lives, about what they worry about the most, about where people need help, and it's now a central concern to the business community. And that's very different from 1993.
Do you get a sense of the broader strokes in government? Can you still look to government, or is that too much of a pipe?
I'm listening, and I mean, you're absolutely right. I'm just taking it from a local perspective. There are so many businesses, small businesses that employ the working class that don't offer insurance or benefits. And these are the people that basically have run the city on, day to day. And there is definitely a need for advocacy, as well as there's a need for certainly a universal approach to it. And so I think that alongside with hopefully government working, we need to have more advocacy on that type of issue.
I've got my little 30-second notice, and I always
Like
make my deal. I want to
seconds.
thank you. I think that obviously it's a time of great promise for New York in particular, but both in Albany and in Washington. And I think that obviously the proof is in the pudding. I mean, do I want to beat a metaphor to death here? Thank you all for coming, and we'll see you next time on CUNY Forum. Thank you.